the final program of the fall season. And we are, I think, going out with a bang with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Quite fittingly, the program is called Cross of Snow. So I encourage you to grab your wine or your cocoa and huddle down with us as we learn about Longfellow. I'm Catherine Allgore. I'm the president here at the Historical Society, and this is the last presentation I'm giving of this year. I'll see you in a couple weeks, but I guess I wanted to end my time with you by saying thank you. We have met so many new friends and supporters during this time period, and I want to thank especially those people who have made their support manifest, allowing us to present programs like this for free, and teacher training and research help and History Day and all that other stuff that we do for basically free. I know there are people out there who have been really long-term supporters, beloved members of the family. Thank you so much for your support always these past years. But I also know we have new people, and I'm also grateful for you as well. So I look forward to seeing you in 2021. But for tonight, let's go visit Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Gavin, will you introduce us in?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that nice greeting. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this program. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm happy to welcome all of you to the last program of 2020. This has certainly been a year that has seen some challenges, but we have also been really amazed by how many people we've been able to join our programs. We're glad that we've been able to be a part of so many people's lives. This evening, we are joined by Nicholas Basbanes, who is the author of 10 works of cultural history. His most recent book, Cross of Snow, has been named Best Book of the Year by the Christian Science Monitor and a Book of the Year by the Times Literary Supplement. He will be speaking on this new book, which explores the life, times, and work of a man who shaped the literature of a new nation with his countless poems, sonnets, stories, essays, and translations. We are, of course, referring to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose renown was so wide-reaching that his deep friendships included Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Julia Ward Howe, and Charles Sumner. This is a great final program for MHS, and it's especially great because Mr. Basbanes' research included many items from our archives. Speaking of the MHS archives, before we get started, I wanted to let you know a little bit about MHS. We hold an amazing collection of manuscripts that's measured in the millions, with the papers of U.S. presidents, soldiers, mothers, pioneers, and everyone in between. To make this relevant for this evening's program, among other things in our collections, we hold the first account of Paul Revere's rise, written by Paul Revere himself, and later made famous a number of years following that by Mr. Longfellow. We publish these collections, we make them available to researchers, and we host an active schedule of programs for the general public, educators, and academic audiences that explore these themes from our collection. We're making our collections and our online programs available for free, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members. If you are not a supporter of MHS, I will hope you'll consider joining or making a year-end gift to the organization. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Basbanes to join us.
Well, thank you, Gavin, and what a great pleasure it is to be with the Massachusetts Historical Society. As Gavin mentioned, I did a good bit of my research at the Historical Society. In fact, I owe a great debt of gratitude for finding some letters basically hiding in plain sight. They're on microfilm of Catherine Maria Sedgwick to Fannie Appleton Longfellow when she was still Fannie Appleton, which really filled in a lot of gaps. And people have often wondered, what took her 7 years to accept Henry's proposal of marriage, which we shall get to in the program here. And I'm going to put some images on the screen here, and we'll get going, as we got a lot of ground to cover tonight. And Across the Snow, Life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Let's get right to it. I thought I'd start with the image of the book, which Gavin, you already showed at the beginning. And I thought I'd just reflect a little bit on it. It is a Julia Margaret Cameron photograph that was taken in 1868 during what can only be regarded as a triumphant tour of Europe. And in England, Henry visited with Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle on July the 4th and met later that day with Charles Dickens. And then when he was with Lord Tennyson, who he outsold in England, by the way, even though he was the poet laureate, Tennyson took him to the Isle of Wight, and Julia Margaret Cameron made this really, I hesitate to use the word iconic, but this iconic photograph of Henry, which is the Longfellow as just about everybody knows him, and as he has been celebrated, the bearded, white-maned, wonderful poet of Paul Revere's Ride, of course, and Hiawatha and Evangeline. But there's another Longfellow, the Longfellow who takes center stage in this book, Across the Snow. And of course, we talk about the worldwide celebrity that he achieved. He was that upper image is a box of Longfellow cigars. It's actually out of my collection. Wedgwood china. There he is with his dog Trap on the side. The marble bust in the center is a reproduction of the likeness erected in his honor at Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey, the only American to date who has been so honored. And of course, there he is in oil by GPA Healy in 1862. He was probably one of the first subjects of paparazzi. Here he is in 1878, and he actually wrote in his journal that night, "There stood another photographer with his deadly instrument aimed at us." That's in 1878. He's with his daughter, Edith. His house was so famous that Sears Roebuck, for close to 30 years, sold a Magnolia copy of it. There are still numerous examples around the country, one in Syracuse, New York, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. They still use it for the Chamber of Commerce. And of course, you talk about the influence of popular culture. A friend of mine, after my book was published, sent me this song of Hiawatha from his collection, and I'm still looking for that Greek copy there. I got that offline, but just he was translated and read in over 30 languages throughout the world. Easily the most influential, the most celebrated poet of his time, and as I said, his impact went throughout popular culture. And here he is. And even though his fame and his celebrities more or less ebbed during the 20th century, and one of the reasons I embarked on this book, in fact, was because I felt he had been unfairly forgotten and maligned, and really maligned is not an unfair word to use to what became of his reputation. But if you look throughout North America, you'll find not only his likeness, but his characters. There's Hiawatha with Minnehaha, and there's Evangeline. There's our friend Paul Revere right in Boston. Just amazing. But this is the Longfellow as both of his wives knew him. Mary, his first wife, Mary, and later for 18 years, Fannie Appleton. Very dapper, handsome young man, brilliant. And here we see him celebrated on oil in a silhouette, 1841, an early photograph. A bust that is in the Wadsworth Longfellow House in Portland, Maine, and a very early sketch made during his second trip to Europe and Sweden. As you can see, he's quite the clothes horse too, and I make a point of that. Not a point of that, but I document it in the book. And just where is Winslow Homer represent the only example of I could find anywhere of Winslow Homer ever doing anything of Longfellow was in Ballew's Pictorial, which he actually did from a photograph. The Eastman Johnson portrait in the center is one of 7 portraits Henry commissioned in 1846 of what he called his Mutual Admiration Society of Friends. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Emerson, Charles Sumner, and a few others, and himself. And for many years, these pictures were only viewable in the house. And of course, now the house is owned by the National Park Service. And it's anyone who goes to visit there when the house is open can appreciate these and many other artworks. But there's Henry over there again with the top hat. I have a feeling he kind of wore that top hat. He was 5 feet 8 inches tall, and his wife Fannie was 5'10". I mean, we talk about a very stately, statuesque, imposing woman. But Henry always took care to dress impeccably. And you will not find any image of him ever where he's not just magnificently attired, tastefully attired. But we start very early with Henry Longfellow. He graduated from Bowdoin College in 1825 at the age of 18. Graduated at the age of 18. And on commencement day, and it's in the files that I saw up in Brunswick, Maine at Bowdoin College, pretty much on commencement day, the Board of Overseers at Bowdoin voted to establish a professorship of modern languages. And they would be the fourth such institution in the United States, Harvard being the first, William and Mary and the University of Virginia being the others. And it was the widow of the founder of the college, James Bowdoin III, who gave funds to establish this chair. And they voted to offer the appointment to young Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who graduated fourth in a class of 38. His classmates included Nathaniel Hawthorne and Horatio Bridge and a number of other very prominent people. It was a very, very famous, high-achieving class. But before he could teach these languages at Bowdoin, he had to go to, it was conditioned upon his going to Europe for a period of time, which turned out to be 3 years, to learn the very languages he would be required to teach. And it's quite a testament, I think, to he was always a young man of purpose and probity and of great honor, and he really had earned the trust of his family to the point that at the age of 18, he finally sailed when he was 19 to Europe, and he spent 3 years abroad learning 6 or 7 or 8 languages, and he's quite the artist. And I photographed every page of his journal in the Houghton Library at Harvard, 9 volumes, hundreds of pages. And here he is sketching himself in local garb and quoting Byron. He really considered himself a traveler, a cosmopolite. And as he learned, he met Washington Irving, and he always said that the book that influenced him most as a young man was a sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon by Irving. And he had the great opportunity to meet and to know Irving when he was in Madrid, who was living with the part of the diplomatic community there, and he was working on his Columbus biography. And Irving impressed upon the young Longfellow that not only should you learn these languages, but you should also learn the literatures, the foreign literatures. Of course, he was inspired to be a poet anyway, but this is something he took to heart. And he became an extraordinary linguist. He knew at least 15 languages. There remain in the Longfellow House today close to 12,000 books. Of these 12,000, they are in 45 different dialects, 15 languages, all of which we know he read, could translate. He was a and did translate fluently into English. Let's remember, he's the first American to translate all of Dante from the Italian into English. He's credited for introducing no fewer than 25 important German writers, Schiller and Goethe, to American readers. He was just quite extraordinary. He had quite an adaptation for languages. He wrote home to his sisters, and he said, you should learn languages. The more languages you know, the more lives you live. In the center, there he is at Göttingen in Germany, and everywhere he went, he wore the native garb. And when his father learned about this from his Henry's brother, he cautioned him, you must always wear your American costume, he called it. Well, Henry would have none of that. And there he is in Italy over there, and he actually called himself Enrico when he was in Italy. He was Enrique in Spain. And he had met 2 wonderful young women during these 3 years abroad, which I went to great pains to document, not only because they are early relationships, but also because his relationships with women throughout his life are quite remarkable. He thoroughly respects women. He said in a Harvard lecture, in which I read the lectures at the Houghton Library, he said that never through in all of Dante will you find a single disparagement of women. And he said the image of Beatrice was with Dante throughout his life. And I felt that you could almost say the exact same thing about Longfellow. Never will you find a single disparagement of women. We're fortunate in that his correspondence with his mother is preserved. And when he's a young man at Bowdoin, you have these remarkable letters that they're exchanging. And he's, by the way, supposed to be watching over his older brother, Stephen, who, like Hawthorne, enjoyed going to Ward's Tavern. Henry was watching over and reporting on his older brother Stephen's deportment, but at the same time, he was having these magnificent literary conversations with his mother that I have 1 or 2 of them in the book. He's quite remarkable. While he was in Europe, his teacher, his Spanish teacher, was a young woman named Florencio Gonzalez, apparently quite beautiful, according to Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, who also knew her and had quite a fancy for her. And then when he got to Italy, there was a woman named Giulia Persiani, and he extended his stay in both of these countries much longer than he was supposed to. He maintained that he was learning the languages. His father kept urging him, you have to get to Germany. And finally he got to Germany. But I call that chapter Awakening for many, many reasons. For many, Henry became a young man, a young, mature man. He started to achieve his potential as a writer, as a diarist. And I think he saw clearly what he wanted out of his life. And we argue, I maintain, that he is perhaps our first great multiculturalist, decades before there was such a phrase. He learned languages, he absorbed languages, he translated them. And when people came to the house later in life, they said, it's remarkable. He speaks French to a Frenchman. He speaks Italian to Italians. When the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro II, visits, they speak Portuguese. When Ole Bull visits, it's Norwegian. When Fredrika Bremer comes, it's Swedish. It's remarkable, a brilliant man. Here he is. He returns from Europe, and he's professor of modern languages in college. And he was also the college librarian for these 4 years. This painting hangs in the Wadsworth Longfellow House in Portland, Maine. Quite a distinguished young man, and he enjoyed himself there, but he really had a hunger to perform on a larger stage, as he wrote to a friend. I mean, I went to Bates College up in Maine, and so I'm a great fan of Bowdoin and the small liberal arts colleges up there. But this is, the 1820s, and Henry had been in the capitals of Europe and had met many people, and he had a hunger to leave Brunswick and to go someplace else, as he said, to perform on a larger stage. And then finally, he did get an opportunity. George Ticknor of Boston, for a number of reasons, actually the loss of a 5-year-old child, decided to leave and retire, take what amounted to early retirement about the age of 43 or 44. George Ticknor, by the way, was the person for whom we named the Ticknor Society in Boston. Both Peter Drummond and I, in fact, were among the founding board members of that society, but it was Ticknor who handpicked Henry to succeed him at Harvard. So Henry again now, but another condition was he had to return to Europe and learn more languages, in particular the German, which he was supposed to really focus on the first time around, but for reasons which I suggested, he learned some, but not enough. And so, yes, he returned, but he also concentrated on the Swedish and on the Danish and a number of other languages while he was there. While he was at Bowdoin, also, he married a young woman named Mary Storer Potter. He loved her dearly. She was a fragile young woman. We know this, from correspondence. She really did not want to make this trip to Europe, but she did. She greatly supported her husband's ambitions and his aspirations. She went on the condition that a couple of her friends would come along, and they did. But sadly, we don't know when she conceived, but she had a miscarriage while they were in Holland, and she died 55 or so days later. And Henry was absolutely devastated, grief-stricken. And I believe if you look at the last stanza of that poem from Footsteps of Angels that he published in 1839, feeling perhaps even a bit of guilt, uttered not yet comprehended, is the Spirit's voiceless prayer, soft rebukes and blessings ended, breathing from her lips of air. He thought that he had lost his happiness forever, but yet he soldiered on. He continued to learn his languages, finally feeling, I have to go and visit the Rhineland, walk through the line and regain my senses. He travels, and lo and behold, through serendipity, he meets in Interlaken in Switzerland this young woman, Frances Fannie Elizabeth Appleton. Here she is, as painted by G.P.A. Healy in 1834. She's about 17 then, kind of what she would have looked like when Henry met her in the center, as she was sculpted by Lorenzo Bartolini in Florence during this grand tour of the continent that her father, the industrialist Nathan Appleton, had put on for his two daughters and his surviving son, Tom. after the death of a 20-year-old brother, Charlie Sedgwick Appleton. And this was, pardon me, 2 years after the loss of their mother from consumption. I recently did an essay, by the way, for Humanities Magazine on dealing with death and dying and contagion in the 19th century as reflected by the Appletons and the Longfellows, and how consumption killed 1 out of 7 people throughout the 19th century. And it was just a way of, it was part of the daily life. And here's Henry grieving the loss of his young wife, and here's Fannie. They have traveling with them. They've not only lost their mother and their brother, but traveling with them as a cousin, William Sullivan Appleton, who is dying of consumption, and he will pass away a week after or so after Henry leaves them. He meets them in Interlaken. Nathan Appleton is sufficiently impressed that he invites them to travel with them for a fortnight. Henry does, and when he gets back to Boston, well, we'll get to that presently, but Fannie is quite an extraordinary young woman. You know, this is 8 months or so after the death of Mary. I don't think he's expecting to be bowled off his feet, but he is. She has been exquisitely trained and educated by private tutors. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody being the first, George Barrell Emerson being among her teachers, Frances Grader, the artist, Frances Lieber teaches her languages. I mean, it's an astonishing number, a succession of teachers that teach her so many different things. But what is really quite remarkable about Fannie Appleton is that not only does she have this privilege of being educated, she embraces it. And she embraces not only the education, but what exactly does she want to do with her life? Does she want to be a writer? Does she want to be an artist? She excels at all of these things. Here's a page from her diary. I estimate about 200,000 words of her journal that she keeps during this 2-year tour. This is from a page when she visits a villa of Petrarch at Vaucluse in 1836, and she plucks a laurel leaf and she fixes it in her journal. And it's just an amazement to read. Her journals are actually more readable and as good as Henry's art, as good as Henry's letters are. I mean, Fanny's are far more easily as interesting and revealing of the woman. And as I said, she's quite the artist. And here's one of the sketches she's done shortly around the time that they meet. And this is at the Castel dell'Ovo in Naples, and it's from the balcony of a seaside palazzo with what I suggest, and I think there's no question about it, is a self-portrait of young Fannie on the lower right. They hit it off. Whether it's definitely not an epiphany, certainly not for Fannie, but they do respect each other's minds. And again, Henry will write his friend George Washington Green, and he will say she is beautiful, but she is not just intelligent. She is a woman of genius. Now, Henry being this great scholar and this linguist, and he's learning and translating German. Together, they're walking, and they spend a fortnight together, traveling together with the family, and together they translate a poem from the German into English. And Henry will later acknowledge that it was even better than his translation, and he used her translation in the book Hyperion, which I'll discuss in a bit. But this is Fanny's, one of 2 copies that Fannie made. One is in the Houghton Library, the other is at the Longfellow House. And look who she has given top billing to, by Fannie E. Appleton and Henry W. Longfellow. I love it. Anyway, Henry returns to Boston. He takes up his new appointment at Harvard, and he starts immediately going from Cambridge, crossing the bridge, the 4 miles from Harvard into Boston, heading up Beacon Hill, up Beacon Street. This is a kind of a contemporary view, 1843 or so, the year they would be married. But that is Beacon Street, about the place where the Appletons live, up at 39 Beacon. And he would wear his good European finery going into Boston, calling on the Appletons, wooing her. We don't know whether or not he made a proposal of marriage. We assume he probably did. But whether he did or he didn't, she rebuffed him. And this is the milieu of Boston along, this would be the Boston Common, looking from Beacon Street over on the left. Again, the Appleton household would be over there on the left. That's from the Boston Library collections. This is just that wonderful neighborhood of Beacon Hill a little later in photographs. Another view of Beacon Street. I have this one in there because it's kind of close to the Appleton home at 39 Beacon Street. This is looking at the George Ticknor, what was the George Ticknor home over there from in front of the State House, the scene of many, many literary soirees. The Appletons would go there. Henry would go there with his friends in the Mutual Admiration Society. And while he was unsuccessfully wooing Fannie, why she is rejecting him, she never really says. But ultimately, she does come around to his proposals. These are portraits by Gilbert Stewart of the patriarch of the Appleton family, Nathan Appleton on the right, Maria Theresa Gold on the left. These paintings now hang in Longfellow House in Cambridge. And this is where Fannie was born, also in Beacon Street, just 54, which is the one on the right. The townhouse on the left was the home of William Hickling Prescott, which is today a museum well worth visiting when it opens again, to give you a sense of how these writers, this community of writers lived in and around Beacon Hill. At that time, a few years later, they moved up the street to 39 Beacon. This is the only photograph I could find. This is the National Historic New England photograph. And I have to say, the only photograph I had to pay to use for my book. Everything else was public domain or pictures that I was able to shoot. But what makes it very scarce is it's still only 3 floors. A 4th floor was added later. But that's what the house would have looked like when the Appletons lived there. This is kind of what it looks like. This is what it looks like today. It was formerly the Women's, the City Club of Boston, the Women's City Club of Boston. It's now a private residence. I had a chance to visit it a few years ago with my wife when it changed hands for $15 million, not to me, to be sure. These were some photographs. That's the wonderful Bullfinch Staircase in the center. This is what it would have looked like when the Appletons lived there. This is how it looks today. These are my pictures. And this is the room where Fannie and Henry would have had their wedding overlooking Boston Common in 1843. But one of the reasons it took 7 years for Fannie to accept this proposal of marriage, we can't say for sure, but Henry rather foolishly, and in my view, it's arguably one of the 2 dumbest things he ever did. The dumbest, in my view, was to insist upon that Mary accompany him to Europe on that first trip. But he decided to write a book, which he called a kind of a romanaclé, folding in a lot of the German romanticism that he had been studying. But he worked in a subplot, a fictional plot of his failed attempts to win the affections of one of Fannie Appleton and the guise of Mary Ashburton. And this is the first illustrated edition from my collection, which is published in 1853. And so that is kind of his vision of Mary Ashburton on the left and Henry on the right. Fannie, of course, was aghast when she saw, and of course he wrote about his passion for this young woman, how he couldn't sleep, he couldn't wake up in the morning without thinking of Mary Ashburton. He couldn't go to sleep at night without thinking of Mary Ashburton. She, needless to say, was not pleased. But it took 7 years, and finally, and here's the acceptance of his proposal of marriage. How this came to pass, we'll have to read about in the book. But there are really no love letters between that you will find. Of the hundreds of letters, 900 or so, thousands of Longfellow letters that survive, and the 900 or so letters from Fannie that survive, you'll really only find what could be described as half a dozen letters that could be called love letters. The reason for that is for 7 years they weren't speaking, and for 18 years they really left each other. In fact, Henry once said after they were married, "It is our theory of life to never be separated." This letter appears in full in my book for the first time. If you read the translation on the right, you can see why the Longfellow family for many years, Victorians really didn't like to admit passion, I guess, or to acknowledge it. But there it is. Andrew Hyland in his collected correspondence described this, I think, rather unfairly unfairly. He said that on May 10th, Fannie accepted unconditionally Henry's proposal. But I think if you read the various factors, I think, that brought Fannie around to the fact that she loved this man, but it was also going to be an intellectual partnership as much as it was going to be a love story. And Henry, a year later, as he did every year on the anniversary of her acceptance of his proposal, he wrote in his journal, "O day forever blessed that ushered in this vita nova of happiness, a new life of happiness, how full the year has been." Why is it so important? Not only is it a great love story that has, as far as I'm concerned, been marginalized and has never really been fully told, and I really believe I give a full biographical treatment of Fannie in this book. She dies tragically in 1861, and then she more or less disappears from the scene. But I think if you look at not only the 18 years of their marriage, but the 7 years leading up to it, and then from 1843 to 1861, you find 18 uninterrupted years of unparalleled productivity. All of the great poems, the long narrative poems, they now issue forth. And not only is she describes herself as a lively spur upon his Pegasus. I think an argument can be made that she worked with him. There's no question that she worked with him and that he showed her everything, and her letters show that not only did she comment on them, but she actually contributed. And in one instance, in the first year of their marriage, she keeps a journal that is so revealing. It's a beautiful journal, and she has her first child, and she stops keeping the journal. She keeps other records, and she writes magnificent letters. But in that first year of marriage, she tells how she insisted that he write the poem, The Arsenal at Springfield, how she's working together with him on the 2-volume Poets and Poetry of Europe, 10 literary traditions that they worked on together. She calls it our book. She helps him with the Danish, with the Swedish. She's a remarkable collaborator and intellectual partner. And on their wedding day, now I have to say, and one of the many things that really attracted me to this subject was not only the opportunity to tell a wonderful new story, a love story, but also to take advantage of the magnificent collection of material objects that are in the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Park over in Cambridge. I believe Henry Longfellow is unique among American writers, and with respect that he has not one, but two totally preserved houses where he lived in, both of which are National Historic Sites, the one in Cambridge and the one up in Portland, which is absolutely well worth visiting as well, which his sister, who became a widow at the age of 23, lived in for the rest of her life, and to which she turned over to the Maine Historical Society. So now it is maintained as it was. But the Longfellow House not only has all authentic, original furnishings, artworks, but domestic items. And they estimate 800,000 artifactual and archival materials. I can't say I looked through all 800,000, but I did spend 5 or 6 years over there. The months turned into the weeks, turned into months, and it was days. And I think the staff wondered if I was ever going to write my book. But of all the material objects that I examined and looked at, this magnificent sketchbook. Look how beautifully tooled it is. And in it, it was the sketchbook that Fannie kept during their trip when she was traveling and when she met Henry. And it's dated July 13th, 1843, and she has inscribed it, Mary Ashburton to Paul Fleming. I saw this and I said, you talk about an object giving you something, telling you something that goes beyond the text. You know, again, you have to curate it a little bit, but the characters in Hyperion were Mary Ashburton, Paul Fleming, and what she is saying, basically, she's paraphrasing Psalm of Life, let the dead past, bury its dead. And then you have 18 uninterrupted years of happiness. Well, another wedding present was this, the house I was just talking about. Nathan Appleton, the industrialist, as a wedding present to the young couple, buys what we now call Longfellow House, what was known at the time as Craigie House, or former owner. And you can see it profiled. It became one of the most visited destinations for literary pilgrims throughout the years of Longfellow living there. Not only was it Longfellow's home for 50 years because he was a boarder there before they married and his father-in-law bought the house, but it was also the command headquarters for George Washington during the siege of Boston during the Revolutionary War. So it was a historic house even before he made it doubly historic. And here's Fannie, and they are among the first, I have to say, because they acquire the house in 1843, and as she says in her journal here, it now too has the sentiment of the future as well as the past, and we were our plans and projects with no desire to change a feature of the old countenance which Washington has rendered sacred. Well, they are among the first who actually want to preserve these old buildings, not to nuke them and to change them or to produce newer houses, more modern houses. They wanted to keep the house as authentic as they could, obviously with the modern conveniences. This is kind of what the house would have looked like when George Washington looked at it before the piazzas were added by later owner Andrew Craigie. That's what Washington would have looked like when he lived there. Here is the house as it appeared in homes of American authors during, not certainly during Henry's lifetime, but also while he and Fannie were living there. So yes, it is urban today, but it was quite the country house in the time. And to just give you an idea of how famous it became, this is a chromolithograph from the American Antiquarian Society. And that's a view of that I shot during an autumnal shot. You can see the Charles River off in the distance in the image. You can't really see it today. There's been growth. As an additional wedding present, by the way, Fannie asked her father to buy the land in front, which he did. So from the house down to the Charles River, so their view would never be obstructed. And it was very far-reaching or far-sighted because the Longfellow Park is there today. This is a wonderful chromolithograph of the house, again, 1904. Upstairs on the second floor, Henry has handwritten from the poem To a Child, which he wrote on the birth of his second child. Once within these walls of once whom memory oft recalls, the father of our country dwelt. People came to visit the house and to see it, but how few of them were admitted inside. And here we see the dining room where they admitted and entertained so many magnificent guests. Those are the Gilbert Stewart paintings off to the right, the famous painting of the three daughters over in the center, the Fannie portrait. Gifts to Henry hanging in the house. This engraving of Evangeline is up in the master bedroom. This is the departure of Hiawatha, presented to Henry during that triumphant trip to Europe in England by Albert Bierstadt. On the back, by the way, is the menu for that evening's dinner. The Psalm of Life, presented to Henry by a calligrapher of the Royal Mandarin Court. And as if Henry has written it on the bottom, it was presented by Burlingame, the consul to the envoy to China during a dinner party at Longfellow House. And this is the library, of course. It's called the library. Notice the busts of the Greek tragedians on top of various bookcases. This is the room where Fannie had her accident. The Martha Washington parlor, Fannie's desk. I love this particular scene of the chamber, because we talk about Longfellow lines entering the lexicon, becoming idiomatic phrases. You have two of them here in one stanza. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened, and voices soft and sweet. It's the three little girls coming down to jump into Papa's lap, and Edith, take note of Edith with golden hair. The study, the man cave of its time, where the Dante Club would meet, where George Washington held the councils of war, where all the great poems were written, where Henry and Fannie, throughout the years of their marriage, got together. And the great highlight of the day was them reading aloud to each other, as you see in these two sketches, the only sketches that survive that they made of each other, both dated 1847. That's Fannie's sketch of Henry at the left, dozing in the study, and that's Henry's sketch of Fannie to the right. He would give up. He would forego going to lectures in Boston because he did not want to miss reading at night with Fannie, and it was her voice. He called it that magnificent musical voice. It was always she reading to him. And here's Henry as pictured in his study in later years. I mentioned the Mutual Admiration Society. These are the Eastman Johnson paintings, portraits. And there he is with his friend Sumner, Charles Sumner, in Washington in 1863 during the Civil War, the only time the two were photographed together. Henry was down nursing his son Charlie, who had been injured in the Civil War. He ran away from home after the death of his mother, joined the Union Army. His father could have had him, required him to be sent home, but because he was underage, but he allowed the young man to serve, and he was injured. He fought heroically and he survived. But when he was ill, Henry, then he also had camp fever. Henry went down both times. You know, I have not been able to get in tonight to the various cultural stories that are going around the Longfellows. But I know one of the allegations, charges often leveled against Longfellow is that he never really engaged himself, certainly in his poetry, with the driving issues of the day. I would just remind you that his poems on slavery were published in 1842, and they were very influential. And they were published a full 10 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. There's a poster. He and Henry actually went into Boston and met with Ellen Craft, who was this African-American slave who actually had a complexion that allowed her to pass as a white man traveling with her manservant, who was actually her husband. It was a sensational story. And of course, they actually wrote a memoir about it. And Henry went into Boston to meet with her in the presence of Frederica Bremer, the Swedish writer who wrote about her. We talked about Paul Revere's poem. You have the story in Paul Revere's hand at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I just, I want to take note of this stanza here. Again, does Longfellow address himself to the issues of the day? For born in the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last. In the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeat of that steed in the midnight message of Paul Revere, arguably the most memorized poem by an American. I don't think anything comes close. And here, that's an NRA, the picture on the right was done by the American Propaganda Office during World War II as an inspirational kind of image. It's never gone out of style. I want you to take note of the date here, May 20th, 1861. This is in Henry's journal. The purple buds of the lilacs tip the hedges, and the flowery tide of spring sweeps on. Paul Revere's Ride was published basically on the very day that the Civil War is about to begin. Now, a month later, there's a sense of foreboding, and the flowery tide of spring sweeps on. And after that, he says, the rumble of warfare is in the sky. He has a sense of presentiment. He doesn't know what it is. You talk about material objects, how objects can speak to you, and they tell you something. When I saw these at Longfellow, I had to sit back and pause. And if you know the story of how Fannie's horrific accident in July of 1861, when she was snipping lockets of hair from her little daughter, Edith with golden hair. And that's Fanny's handwriting in these 5 envelopes that survived, 4 of which contain one of those lockets. Her dress caught fire. She was sealing these envelopes with a candle of how it happened. Nobody saw it except the little girls, but the next day she was dead. And this idyllic life, which I call in the book Camelot and the Charles, in a moment was turned upside down. And the grief that he suffered before with the death of Mary, it was compounded by many magnitudes. But, he soldiered on. He had 5 children. He now became a single father, a stay-at-home father. And within a year or two, he's working on other poems, the Tales of a Wayside Inn. He's repurposing Paul Revere's Ride, which becomes a landlord's tale. And this is a chromolithograph from Currier and Ives. This is how popular the book became. And there's the Visitor's edition of 1913 with a wonderful cover, wonderful cover with photo imagery. That's the first edition in 1863. And Henry also used living people for this particular as narrator. That's Ole Bull, the Norwegian violinist featured on the frontispiece. Henry also turned to translation. You know, we talk as collectors about condition being important. Well, it's also necessary here. You're talking about an association copy that's not been read to death, but it's been read to tatters. This is his first set of Dante, given to him as a gift by his friend George Washington Green, who he met in that first trip to Europe. It's given to Longfellow, to his friend, and it's dated there 18th. And you can just see how he's read that volume, and he becomes the first American to translate all of Dante into English. These are very important. This is Fanny's favorite portrait of Henry on the left. That is Henry's favorite portrait of Fannie on the right. Hold that thought for a moment. 3 years ago, these photographs were acquired by Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. I believe, and they previously unrecorded, they appear in my book for the first time. They are, I believe, these abrotopes, they represent the last photographs of the two taken 1860. So Fannie died the following year, and that's the last picture of Henry without the beard. He grew the beard after her accident. He had suffered facial injuries, and that's one of the reasons he grew the long beard, by which we know him best. So here everything comes together. We have a manuscript. Again, I sat back had to pause when I came across this document in the archives at the Houghton Library, and it's the holographic copy of The Cross of Snow, that the poem that he wrote on the 18th anniversary of Fanny's death, 18 years to the day that she died. They had been married 18 years, and that portrait that we mentioned being his favorite hanging in the master bedroom. So you have the poem, you have the bedroom where they lived untouched, and that's their bed, that's the portrait. And he writes this poem. He's contemplating that poem in the first 8 lines of this sonnet, which remains unpublished in his lifetime. When he finishes writing it that night, he tucks it in this envelope. And he writes, "In the long sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall where around its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and soul more white never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose, nor can in books be read the legend of a life more benedight." Now, thrifty Yankee that he was, he didn't waste paper. The first 8 lines are on this side. The next 6 lines, making it a perfect Petrarchan sonnet, are on the other, and he's now contemplating another painting seen by millions of people, and which won the gold medal at the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876. And because he had seen this mountain, he never acknowledges having seen this painting by Thomas Moran, but clearly he did, as you will see by these lines. He says, "There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died." Well, Henry died in 1882. He's buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. His younger brother, Samuel Longfellow, who would write the first biography, said that that on the casket was placed a spray of passion flowers, and he had known the victory, and he had known defeat. And finally, in the spirit of the season, we'll end with Christmas bells. Every year around this time at Longfellow House, they have a gathering for the season, and they decorate it in a manner that was consistent with the times. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And of course, the writing of that poem, Henry had been visiting with his son in Washington, who was recovering. And one Sunday morning, he was staying in a hotel. He heard the cannonade going off across the Potomac artillery shells, and at the same time he heard bells, and he was inspired to write this poem. And that is my presentation. I apologize for the little delay at the beginning, but I managed to get it all in, and we'll go back to Gavin.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nick. That was a wonderful presentation, and Longfellow certainly is a unique view into the 19th century. Such a powerful and commanding figure. So we have a number of questions. So one question we have is, Longfellow has great mass appeal in his day. Did his popularity impact how his contemporaries viewed him and his work? Did they take him less seriously because of his fame?
Well, I certainly think with respect to Poe, who detested him, and I think a lot of that certainly has to do with his popularity. I mean, he wasn't universally acclaimed by his contemporaries. I mean, Margaret Fuller was not enamored with his work, but at least she was decent in her criticism of his work. Whitman was very respectful of his work. He didn't write much about it. He wrote an obituary that kind of praised it and kind of didn't. But I think for the most part, you read, like Hawthorne, of course, was his very good friend, but you read the British seem to especially appreciate his work and continue to do so to this day. I mean, I think you find it with other writers today. I mean, you had people who loved his work, and you had people who were critical of it. One of the complaints, maybe he wasn't as original as others might have liked him to be, that he relied too much on sources or whatever. But I don't think it's any different from what you might find with other writers of the day. He had people who admired him for the most part, and he had his detractors, but not all that many. I mean, the most prominent of whom was Poe, but I think his reasons for detesting Longfellow went well beyond dismissal of his work.
Well, Poe also kind of detested Boston, so
that was part of it.
Stroke.
Called him the Frog Pondy. No, I mean, it was.
Okay. Well, Gilbert, why was Longfellow's reputation in decline during the 20th century?
Well, I mean, I discussed it in the introduction to my book. I mean, there was a new world, modernism, the new critics, the old forms. I mean, his work was. Jill Lepore wrote an essay on the 150th anniversary of Paul Revere's ride, and she quoted a letter that Henry received from a 9-year-old girl in Ohio, and she said, "Oh, Professor Longfellow," I'm paraphrasing, "I love your work. I've committed so much of it to memory. I love all your work." And she said, for a 9-year-old, for children to love your work and to understand it, to the modernist, was the sloppy kiss of death. I mean, the sweet, sloppy kiss of death. The modernists were looking for a big, fat target. I mean, to reject and to throw out. The great Daniel Aaron, the late Daniel Aaron, the founding president of the Library of America, who passed away a few years ago at the age of 103, and a great champion of Longfellow's work, said, American poetry is not all that vast that we can afford to dismiss and forget a poet as good as Longfellow. I mean, he was dismissed and he was kicked out of the canon, not for reasons that people stopped enjoying his poetry or his writing, but he was no longer anthologized. How can a poet be read if he's not in the anthologies? And I document this. This isn't just a flat, wild, petulant accusation. I mean, I think it's fairly well documented. I think it's fairly well known that he was rejected through much of the 20th century, but he's been making a wonderful comeback. And if I can contribute in some small way to that, then, I've done a good thing. I'm happy about that, because that was kind of something I was hoping to accomplish.
Well, Roma wrote, thinking of the arsenal at Springfield, would you say Longfellow was a pacifist?
His wife particularly was a pacifist, and Henry was too. There were no weapons, there were no guns in the house. But Charlie, the firstborn Charlie, I mean, there's a quick story. Charlie was a very active kid. After he moved into the house, Charlie lived there after he served in the Civil War. Well, you'll find some rifles over there. Those were Charlie's. but she would never allow any kind of weapon in the house. But Charlie had a little musket that his father allowed him to buy with his own money, and he filled it with gunpowder and blew his left thumb off. I mean, this is quite a story, and the kid actually had a hard time being allowed to join the army. But Fannie was furious and distraught about that. But when they went on their honeymoon, and this is in 1843, to the Springfield Armory, which is where the Springfield rifles, of course, were made, and there were many thousands of, it's a national park site now, a historic park site now. They have these hundreds, thousands of muskets pointed with their barrels pointed upward. And to Fannie, that suggested, she called it the devil's organ, upon which the devil plays his song of death. And she was the one that urged, her words, urged Henry to write what she called a peace poem, urged it upon him. And he did write that poem along the lines she suggested. And then Charles Sumner would actually quote this or mention this poem in one of his famous speeches, one of his famous anti-war speeches. But yes, Longfellow detested warfare, he detested weapons, and as of course as did his wife, and there's no question about that.
Great. So we have a question from Lynn, who said, earlier in the presentation, I saw a bust of Longfellow that was made by Benjamin Paul Akers. I'm a descendant of his sister, and I'm wondering if you know how well the two men knew each other. Since I know that Benjamin Akers was friends with Hawthorne, Emerson, and others in the same circle, do you know anything about how this bust came about? Thank you. This has been wonderful.
I don't, but I would suggest send me an email through my website, and I'll endeavor to find the answer, because I can find that out. That's something that we can find out, and I'd be delighted to learn it myself. So please send me an email, and I'll endeavor to answer it for you. But the short answer is I don't know.
Having worked in history for a long time, I know that often the best answer is to say, I don't know.
Again, there are 800,000 items there, and the artworks there are fabulous. I think so many of them were acquired in the years before there was an MFA. And Fannie's brother, Tom Appleton, was one of the founding spirits of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he actually wrote the first catalog of its holdings. And they were of course patrons of the Boston Athenaeum. And Fannie was, as a young artist, was allowed to go, because the Athenaeum was also an art museum back in that day, and she was allowed to go and see the paintings there, which was quite a privilege for a young woman, because it was a men's only library. But she writes in a journal, once I saw Audubon's original paintings today at the Boston Athenaeum.
So Sarah wrote, great talk. What was Longfellow's relationship to religion and spirituality?
He's not all that, he doesn't lose his faith. He's a Unitarian. He's a Unitarian, as is his wife. Fannie's father, Nathan Appleton, converted to Unitarianism. He writes he was a strict Calvinist growing up, and he became a Unitarian. And in fact, the woman that he married, Maria Theresa Gold Appleton, I'm sure that a lot of that had to do with Channing. They were all followers of Channing, and so he was a very spiritual man. But you don't see it. I think you could have seen it with the death of not one wife but two wives, especially the horrific death of Fannie. You could see all of you could almost understand if he were to lose his blame forces that were outside of his control, but he didn't. And he a letter he got from George William Curtis once, just admiring him for how the fortitude that he was holding up under this enormous loss and strain. And Longfellow says, to the world outside, I am calm, but inwardly I am bleeding to death. But he had the children, and he certainly had a source of faith, inner faith there, that I think helped sustain him. But he wasn't overly vocal about it.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question, and then I think we'll wrap up, just in being conscious of people's time. Mora wrote, can you tell us anything about Henry's relationship with his father-in-law, Nathan Appleton?
It's respectful. And when they go to the house, when they visit, he'll say, we're going to 39 today, 39 Beacon Street. I do know that there's a tremendous, I didn't have a chance to get into it here, but there was a tremendous falling out between Nathan Appleton, who was Fannie's father, the textile industrialist. He was the founder of Lowell, Massachusetts, the first industrial city, and Charles Sumner, who was Henry's closest and dearest friend, and also a friend of the Appleton family. Nathan Appleton's second wife, after the death of his wife, was a cousin of Charles Sumner. She was a Sumner. Her name was Sumner, so they were very friendly. And yet, of course, when the great abolitionist Sumner is talking about the real root causes of slavery, can be attributed to, he said, the cotton spinners of the North and the slaveholders of the South, the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom, the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. It became a soundbite. This was in a speech out in Worcester at the Free Soil Convention. Well, when he did that, there was a total, absolute falling out between Nathan Appleton and Charles Sumner. And you can just imagine the very, very, very fine line that Henry and his wife had to walk between his father-in-law, her father, who was clearly the object of that, as he saw it, a slander, and Sumner, who remained his closest and dearest friend. And so he walks a very fine line, but he maintains a very respectful relationship with him. When Fannie becomes the first woman in North America to bear a child with the assistance of ether, the Appleton family was decidedly against it. Everyone was against it. He couldn't find a doctor in Boston that would agree to administer it. Finally, he goes to Nathan Cooley Keep, the dentist, who they use it for dental surgery, and Keep agrees to administer it, and the midwife will oversee the delivery of the child. But this was done against the opposition of the Appletons and also the Longfellow family. Fannie wrote a letter. She said, "I'm sorry you all thought me so naughty about taking the ether." And she's the first one, very courageous woman. And of course, she didn't get any publicity for that. It was anonymous at the time, but it's been well documented. But again, the relationship with the Appleton family was correct. And I believe, how did Nathan Appleton look at Henry? I think he liked him, because when they met in Switzerland, he had to have passed muster to be with Nathan Appleton, who was escorting his daughters, to be invited to travel with them for a fortnight. And I think that they maintained a very cordial, correct relationship for the remainder of their days.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. And of course, you always learn something.
You really ended our season with a bang, and we thank you so much. Happy holidays, Nick. Happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in tonight. It's been a lot of fun.
And we hope people will consider buying a copy of Nick's book. It is available at independent bookstores, including Porter Square Books, who does not support us at all, but we just like to promote independent bookstores. For the people remaining, I'd like to let them know that we actually passed 8,000 people in attendance this year for the first time ever.
Wow.
Thanks for joining us.
That's amazing.
And thank you, Nick, for a great presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everybody.